Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. This content is intended purely for entertainment purposes. What you are about to witness is not a polite celebrity interview, nor is it a carefully choreographed exchange of rehearsed talking points. It is something far more volatile and far more revealing. What happens when you take a man who believes politeness is often just a socially acceptable form of dishonesty and drop him directly into the epicenter of American daytime television. A world where emotions are currency, outrage is the dominant language, and public perception is managed with surgical precision. What happens when that man is not a politician, not an actor desperate to protect a brand, but a comedian who has spent over 2 decades turning discomfort, silence, and brutal honesty into weapons of mass destruction? What happens is not an interview. What happens is a dissection. This is the story of how Ricky Gervais walked straight into the lion's den, that is The View, locked the door from the inside, and calmly explained to the lions exactly why their teeth were fake. In the modern pantheon of Hollywood disruptors, Ricky Gervais occupies a category entirely his own. He is not merely a comedian. He is not simply a provocateur or a contrarian. He is a glitch in the carefully curated matrix of celebrity culture, a system built on unspoken rules, mutual flattery, and the constant fear of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. While most celebrities walk the red carpet with calculated smiles, terrified of unflattering camera angles or a single sentence being taken out of context, Gervais strolls through it holding a pint of beer, treating the industry's most sacred rituals with the amused contempt of a schoolboy who knows the headmaster has no real power over him. We saw this most famously at the Golden Globe Awards, standing on one of the most prestigious stages in entertainment, addressing the most powerful actors, producers, and executives in the world. Gervais did the unthinkable. He told them directly, unapologetically, and with surgical precision, that their awards were meaningless, that their speeches were hollow, that their moral grandstanding was laughable, that they were in no position to lecture the public about virtue, politics, or justice. And the most terrifying part, he was right, and everyone in the room knew it. Ricky Gervais understands a fundamental truth that publicists, image consultants, and media strategists spend millions of dollars trying to obscure. If you genuinely do not care about the consequences, you are effectively untouchable. Power only works on those who are afraid of losing something. Gervais is not afraid of losing approval, access, or invitations. He does not need the industry to love him. He barely even needs it to tolerate him. That is what makes him dangerous, and yet, in 2018, the producers of The View either failed to understand this, or believed they could manage it. They thought they were booking a guest, a comedian, a quirky British personality who would offer a few jokes, promote his latest project, and leave behind a round of applause and a harmless viral clip. What they didn't realize was that they weren't booking an interview. They were inviting a mirror. The View is a uniquely American institution. It thrives on strong opinions, emotional exchanges, and a performative sense of moral authority. It is a space where outrage is often framed as righteousness, and disagreement is treated as a personal failing rather than an intellectual one. Guests are expected to play by unspoken rules, show deference, express gratitude, affirm the panel's world view, and never under any circumstances challenge the premise of the show itself. Ricky Gervais does not acknowledge unspoken rules. From the moment he took his seat at the table, there was a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't aggressive, he was relaxed, almost amused. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, he did so with a calm detachment that immediately disarmed the usual tactics of interruption, moral framing, and emotional escalation. Where others would apologize, he clarified. Where others would soften, he sharpened. Where others would retreat, he leaned in. The hosts attempted to corner him with questions designed to provoke contrition or outrage. He responded with logic, with irony, with uncomfortable truths delivered so casually that they landed like blunt force trauma. He refused to adopt their language, rejected their framing, and dismantled their assumptions without raising his voice. And that is what made it devastating. This wasn't a shouting match. This wasn't a meltdown. This was a forensic examination of modern celebrity culture. formed live in real time by someone who had absolutely nothing to lose. Every attempt to shame him failed. Every effort to bait him collapsed under the weight of his indifference. He didn't argue to win. He explained to expose. He didn't seek approval. He dismantled the very idea that approval mattered. By the time the segment ended, it was painfully clear what had happened. The lions had not devoured their guest. The guest had calmly explained why the cage existed in the first place. And millions of viewers watching at home understood exactly why Ricky Gervais remains one of the most dangerous men in entertainment, not because he is cruel, but because he is honest in a system built on polite lies. This wasn't just television. It was an autopsy. They believed they were inviting a problem, one that could be managed, corrected, and ultimately displayed as a moral victory. In their minds, this was not an interview but a public lesson, a spectacle carefully designed to showcase the panel's intellectual and ethical authority. They saw themselves not merely as hosts, but as arbiters of decency, guardians of acceptable thought, and curators of cultural virtue. The guest was controversial, yes, but controversy, when properly handled, could be turned into content, ratings, and a reassuring reaffirmation of their own righteousness. Weeks before the taping, the machinery of condemnation began quietly humming behind the scenes. Producers combed through archives of old stand-up routines, late-night monologues, and half-remembered jokes stripped of context. Writers prepared questions not to explore ideas, but to corner them. Accusations were sharpened into neat sound bites, polished just enough to appear reasonable, yet pointed enough to draw blood. Every potential answer was anticipated, every deviation accounted for. At least, they believed it was. What they didn't understand was that they weren't preparing an interrogation. They were drafting a eulogy for their own credibility, because there is something uniquely catastrophic about attempting to explain irony to people who believe sincerity is the only legitimate mode of speech. Satire to them is not a tool but a threat. Context is inconvenient, nuance is suspicious, and comedy, true comedy, terrifies those who rely on rigid moral frameworks, because it exposes how fragile those frameworks really are. As Ricky himself would later describe the experience, it felt less like a discussion and more like an educational experiment doomed from the start. Teaching irony to the self-appointed guardians of daytime television, he said, was like teaching algebra to a goldfish. You explain carefully, you simplify, you repeat yourself, they nod, they blink, and then they respond with something that suggests they absorbed absolutely nothing at all, not out of malice necessarily, but out of an almost impressive inability to process abstraction. The date was finalized. The studio was prepped with the meticulous precision of a controlled environment. Lights were softened, angles adjusted, everything calibrated to produce warmth and safety. The visual language of compliance. This was not a space designed for confrontation, but for gentle correction, a place where guests were meant to feel relaxed enough to concede, to apologize, to agree. The audience filled the seats early, a restless sea of faces buzzing with excitement. Some came because they admired the guest. Others came hoping to see him taken down a peg or two. Most didn't realize they were about to witness something closer to a cultural autopsy than a talk show segment. They laughed at the warm-up jokes. They applauded when prompted. They had no idea the room was about to become a crime scene, one where reputations, not people, would be fatally wounded. Then he walked out. Ricky Gervais entered the stage with the unbothered posture of a man who had nothing to lose and even less to prove. He looked exactly as expected, slightly disheveled, casually dressed, carrying the energy of someone who had wandered in from a pub, rather than a carefully curated media environment. He smiled, not nervously, not defensively, but with the calm amusement of someone already aware of how the story would end. He waved, accepted the applause, and took his seat, as if this were all mildly entertaining rather than strategically hostile. What the audience didn't see was the chaos he carried quietly with him, years of experience, a deep understanding of media dynamics, and most dangerously of all, an absolute refusal to pretend that bad arguments deserved respect simply because they were delivered politely. The opening exchange unfolded exactly as planned. At least on the surface, smiles were exchanged, Compliments were offered. Laughter bubbled up in all the right places. The hosts, led by the ever-confident Joy Behar, welcomed him warmly, though the warmth stopped just short of their eyes. This was the ritual: praise first, confrontation later, the spoonful of sugar before the medicine. One host leaned forward, voice coated in practiced admiration, and delivered the line they had rehearsed repeatedly. "When you host the Golden Globes," she said, "you're often politically incorrect, but hilarious." It was a sentence engineered to sound flattering while functioning as an indictment. Politically incorrect was not offered as praise, it was a label. A containment strategy, a way to frame everything he might say next as reckless, irresponsible, and morally suspect before he had even opened his mouth. But Ricky saw the trap immediately. He understood what they were trying to do because he had seen it countless times before. Reduce complexity to intent. Reduce intent to malice. Reduce malice to guilt. It was a familiar playbook, one that relied entirely on the assumption that the audience would accept the host's moral framing without question. That assumption would prove to be their fatal error, because irony does not survive in a vacuum, and comedy cannot be interrogated like a criminal suspect. And when people who mistake moral certainty for intelligence attempt to lecture someone who thrives on exposing hypocrisy, the result is rarely educational. It is usually catastrophic, and this time was no exception. A lesser guest might have responded with humility. He might have smiled politely, dipped his head, and offered a safe, agreeable line, something rehearsed and inoffensive, like, "Oh, I just try my best," or "I'm grateful people enjoy the humor." That is how celebrities are trained to survive these moments: deflect, flatter, retreat. But Ricky Gervais has never survived by retreating. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes lit with unmistakable amusement, the kind that signals not gratitude, but anticipation. He smiled not because he felt flattered, but because he recognized the structure of what was unfolding. "So, thank you," he said calmly, almost casually. Then, without missing a beat, he continued, "So this is, well, yes, the classic you're politically incorrect setup?" Within the first 30 seconds, he had done something profoundly destabilizing. He named the game. He exposed the mechanics of the conversation while it was still pretending to be polite. He acknowledged the trap before the hosts had a chance to spring it. In doing so, he robbed it of its power. Ricky knew exactly what they were attempting because he had spent decades navigating and dismantling this precise format. He had faced critics sharper, crowds colder, and institutions far more hostile than a daytime talk show panel. This was familiar territory. He had played this game before, and he had won it repeatedly. On the surface, the air in the studio remained light. The smiles were still present. The laughter still arrived on cue. But for anyone who had followed Ricky Gervais's career closely, the warning signs were already there. They knew this was not a man who accepted compliments at face value. They knew that, to Ricky, praise is rarely an endpoint. More often, it is merely the dull preamble to a much sharper conversation. Ricky does not treat compliments the way normal celebrities do, where others accept them as currency, polite exchanges meant to smooth interaction. Ricky treats them as intellectual provocations. A compliment in his hands becomes something to interrogate, dismantle, and often weaponize. He doesn't bask in approval, he questions it, and that habit has left a trail of stunned hosts in its wake. The most famous casualty of this tendency might be Jimmy Fallon. Fallon, the reigning king of niceness, the man whose brand is built entirely on enthusiasm and affirmation, once attempted this very strategy. He invited Ricky onto The Tonight Show and tried to disarm him with warmth. Compliments flowed freely, smiles were abundant, the goal was clear: overwhelm the guest with kindness until no conflict could survive. Ricky dismantled the strategy instantly. "Oh, thank you," he said, preempting Fallon's praise. "By the way, I look great." It was an absurd statement delivered with deliberate confidence. Fallon hesitated, caught off guard. "Yeah, is that sarcasm?" he asked, his voice tinged with genuine uncertainty. When Fallon attempted to recover by offering a sincere compliment, "No, really, you do look great," Ricky refused to accept it. He didn't say thank you, he didn't deflect modestly. Instead, he treated the compliment as though it were an insult to basic reality. "Look at me," Ricky replied bluntly, "of course I don't look great." And then he went further. He leaned into the discomfort, expanding it, savoring it. He reminded the audience, and Fallen, of previous conversations about aging, hair loss, and bodily decay. He spoke openly, graphically, about getting older, about sagging flesh, about distended testicles. The studio audience gasped first, then erupted into laughter. Fallen, a host who thrives on positivity and lightness, suddenly found himself discussing distended testicles on national television. The kindness strategy had failed spectacularly. When Fallen attempted to rescue the moment, suggesting Ricky's weight gain might just be big bones, Ricky annihilated the excuse with a brutal, visceral image. Yeah, he shot back, big bones covered in meat and gravy. That's what gets people fat. There was no comfort offered. No polite fiction accepted. Ricky refused the lie because to him, lies, especially flattering ones, are intellectually insulting. He would rather ruin the flow of a show than participate in a false narrative designed to preserve comfort. And that was the man now sitting on the stage of The View. Joy Behar and her co-hosts were attempting a familiar maneuver, the classic setup designed to frame the guest before the conversation truly began. They were unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant, that their guest was someone who happily describes his own body as meat and gravy, purely to disrupt a host's rhythm. This was not a man interested in being redeemed, corrected, or gently guided toward enlightenment. For a moment Ricky remained unusually quiet. He listened, he watched, he allowed the setup to take shape in real time, like a trap being assembled in plain sight. The pleasantries lingered just long enough to establish contrast. Then the shift occurred. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a slight change in the studio's atmosphere. The emotional pressure in the room seemed to drop, as if something heavy had settled into place. The warmth evaporated, the smiles tightened, the casual talk about the Golden Globes dissolved, replaced by something colder and more deliberate. The hosts pivoted. Really? One of them asked pointedly. Around since the Golden Globes, you've kept a low profile. The question was framed as curiosity, but its intent was unmistakable. It wasn't an observation. It was an accusation disguised as commentary. A suggestion that absence equaled guilt, that silence implied wrongdoing. The unspoken message was clear. You disappeared because you went too far, and then they pressed the button. Well, they attacked you. One host said, her tone sharpening, and they said you were mean and rude, and you said you were surprised by that. The pleasantries were gone, the gloves were off, the interrogation had begun. What they failed to realize, what they had always failed to realize, was that this was exactly where Ricky Gervais thrives. There it was, the moment they had been waiting for, the carefully prepared gotcha, the pivot from polite conversation to moral prosecution. This was the instant the panel intended to reframe Ricky Gervais, not as a comedian, not as a satirist, but as a bully who had finally been humbled by public opinion. The implication was clear. The world had moved on, standards had changed, and Ricky had failed to keep up. Now they believed he would have to answer for it. They wanted him to flinch. They wanted him to concede pain, to acknowledge regret, to signal that he had learned his lesson. In their ideal version of events, he would soften. He would apologize. He would admit that the backlash had hurt him, that perhaps he had gone too far, that the outrage had been justified. It would be a tidy resolution, one that reaffirmed their authority and validated the cultural narrative they were eager to defend. But Ricky did none of that. He simply looked at them, his expression calm, unreadable, almost serene. There was no panic in his eyes, no defensiveness in his posture. He didn't rush to explain himself or rush to reassure anyone. He waited, and that waiting alone was destabilizing. Joy Behar, sensing what she believed was blood in the water, decided to press forward. This was her moment. She reached for the specific piece of evidence they had prepared in advance, the example meant to seal the case. She brought up the Sex and the City 2 poster. For the audience watching at home, this was supposed to be the smoking gun. This was the proof that Ricky Gervais wasn't just provocative, he was cruel. He had mocked a beloved franchise. He had aimed his humor at women, worse still, women of a certain age. In the moral economy of daytime television, this was supposed to be indefensible. Joy began to read the charge aloud, carefully, deliberately, like a prosecutor presenting damning testimony. You said, she reminded him, I was sure the Golden Globe would go to the team that airbrushed that poster. The line hung in the air. It was, unmistakably, a classic roast joke, sharp, observational, and brutally honest in the way satire often is. It pointed not at the actresses themselves, but at the industry's obsession with artificial perfection. But within the framework of the View, jokes were never just jokes. They were treated as moral declarations. And moral declarations could be condemned. Jokes aren't just jokes. The show had long implied, they reveal who you really are. So yeah, one of the hosts declared confidently, a little sexist. The label landed like a verdict. Sexist, no nuance, no debate. Just the scarlet letter slapped onto him for the audience to see. The room went quiet. The audience collectively held its breath. The camera zoomed in on Ricky's face, searching for a crack. This was the moment where PR consultants scream internally. This was the moment where celebrities retreat into rehearsed apologies. This is where most people say, I didn't mean it that way. I respect women. I love the cast. I'm sorry if anyone was offended. That is how reputations are salvaged, but Ricky Gervais does not backpedal. He charges, no, it's not. He said immediately. His voice wasn't raised. There was no anger in it, but it was firm. Decisive in a way that cut straight through the accusation. And then he did something even more disruptive. He didn't defend the joke. He challenged the judgment. Why is it sexist? The question landed like a dropped glass. Suddenly, the burden of explanation had shifted. He wasn't scrambling to justify himself. He was demanding that they justify their outrage. The temperature in the room plummeted. The hosts, who had been comfortably seated in moral authority just seconds earlier, were suddenly on the back foot. They began to scramble, reaching for language that could support the certainty they had just expressed. Well, because you're saying that the girls are older and they need to be airbrushed, Joy stammered, trying to give shape to the offense. Ricky didn't allow the sentence to finish. No. He cut in calmly. I think they look great at their age. In that moment, he flipped the entire narrative on its head. He looked at the panel, not with anger, but with something closer to confusion, even pity. As if he genuinely didn't understand how they had arrived at their conclusion. I don't think you lose your sensuality or your beauty because you hit 53, he continued. It was a devastating counterstroke. By accusing him of sexism and ageism, they had inadvertently exposed their own assumptions. They were the ones who believed beauty expired. They were the ones who believed age required concealment. They were the ones who assumed that airbrushing was necessary, expected, or desirable. Ricky simply said out loud what they were unwilling to confront. You think they need airbrushing? His argument implied, I don't. The silence that followed was heavy. The audience shifted in their seats, realizing that the moral script had unraveled. What had been framed as an attack on women was suddenly revealed as a critique of an industry, and of a mindset that equates worth with youth. Ricky hadn't just defended himself. He had turned the mirror back on his accusers. And in doing so, he exposed the fragility of their outrage. They had come prepared to shame a comedian. Instead, they found themselves defending ideas they hadn't realized they believed. What began as a casual conversation quickly revealed itself as something far more calculated. Emboldened by his refusal to submit, by his unwillingness to apologize for a crime that existed only in implication, they reached for a bigger weapon. If they couldn't get him on the poster, if they couldn't accuse him directly of saying the wrong thing, laughing at the wrong thing, or standing on the wrong stage, then they would come for something else. Something safer, something easier to moralize. They would get him on his hiring practices. The battlefield shifted without warning, the way it always does in these encounters. No longer was this about comedy, context, or intent. Now it was about optics, representation, symbolism. The conversation pivoted sharply to his HBO special, Talking Funny asterisk. One of the hosts said, emphasizing the asterisk as if it carried an indictment of its own. We just saw a clip from it, right? Ricky nodded cautiously. So, the host continued, setting the trap with deliberate calm. We've got Jerry Seinfeld, Chris Rock, Louis C.K., and you. The names were listed slowly, each one landing like a piece of evidence being laid on a courtroom table. 4 men, no women comedians on that panel. The implication hung in the air, thick and unmistakable. Asterisk, you excluded women. The audience murmured. The moment had been engineered perfectly. This was no longer a discussion. It was an accusation framed as a question. The host leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, voice sharpening. So who would you replace? They demanded. It was a loaded question, expertly designed to force a loss no matter how he answered. Name a woman, and he would be accused of insulting a legend by suggesting she deserved the spot more than someone else. Refuse to name one, and he would be branded biased, exclusionary, intimidated. It was the kind of question prosecutors ask when they already know the verdict. No, who? Ricky fired back immediately, refusing to accept the premise. The bluntness caught them off guard. Because it was 4 people, he explained, stripping away the conspiratorial tone they were trying so desperately to construct. Just 4 people, but that wasn't good enough. They pressed him again, their voices tightening, the smiles disappearing. Okay, but still, who would you take off? This time, Ricky didn't hesitate. He delivered a truth so simple, so unremarkable, that it shattered the entire narrative they were attempting to build. I wouldn't, he said plainly. There was a pause. Confusion flickered across their faces. I'd just add, he continued, initially playing nice, offering an olive branch. I'd add more people. But then he dropped the reality, the part they didn't want to hear. No, he said firmly, they're my friends, and I chose my friends. That was it. No manifesto, no apology, no ideological justification. He wasn't curating a diversity panel for the United Nations. He wasn't assembling a moral exhibit designed to reflect every demographic category. He was talking to people he knew, people he respected, people he had history with, friends, but the hosts couldn't accept this answer because it didn't give them what they needed. They needed a victim. They needed a villain, they needed a motive, so they invented one. Well, the host sneered, a thin smile creeping across their face. Men are intimidated by funny women. Maybe you didn't want them in the room. There it was. A motive projected onto him that didn't exist. A psychological diagnosis masquerading as insight. The kind of accusation that sounds profound but requires no evidence, only confidence. That's a joke, Ricky said, his patience thinning, his tone sharpening. Watch out. The warning wasn't aggressive, it was weary. The sound of someone realizing in real time that the conversation was no longer honest. Seriously, he added, because now he understood, he wasn't speaking to peers. He wasn't speaking to fellow comedians. He wasn't even speaking to critics. He was speaking to prosecutors, people who had already written the verdict and were simply waiting for him to confess. People for whom context was irrelevant, intent was inconvenient, and explanation was just another opportunity to twist his words. Every answer he gave was being filtered through a conclusion they had already reached. They didn't want nuance, they didn't want reality, they wanted submission, and when they didn't get it, they escalated. The irony, of course, was suffocating. A man known for offending everyone equally was now being accused of calculated exclusion. A comedian whose entire career was built on dismantling sacred cows was being asked to apologize for not curating a perfectly balanced seating arrangement. The very people who preached authenticity recoiled when he actually practiced it. Ricky sat there, fully aware now that no explanation would be enough, that every attempt at reason would be reframed as defensiveness, that every refusal to kneel would be interpreted as proof of guilt. This was never about women in comedy, it was about control, and for the first time in the interview, the audience could see it too, the shift from conversation to prosecution, from curiosity to condemnation. The moment when humor stopped being the subject and morality became the weapon. Ricky leaned back slightly, his expression no longer amused, no longer playful, just alert, calculating. A man who had walked into what he thought was a discussion and realized too late that he was standing in a courtroom where the trial had already ended. The verdict in their minds was already in. All that remained was whether he would beg for mercy or refuse to play along.